Hello there, my name's Ben and welcome to the very first video here on Rock and Roll Rugby, my rugby channel where we'll be discussing everything from breaking news in rugby to post-match reviews and looking ahead to big events. Talking of big events, we've got the quarterfinals coming up this weekend of the Heineken's Champions Cup and the Challenge Cup as well. Last weekend we had the knockout stages where there was a dismal weekend for Pro 14 sides. Only Leinster, Ulster and Benetton are the sides that will be going through to compete in the quarterfinals at this stage of the tournament. Looking back at the weekend, there were 6 instances where Pro 14 sides were knocked out against Gallagher Premiership opposition, which has got the rugby community talking. Just how much of a difference is there between the Premiership and the Pro 14? Is it a quality issue? Is it a standard of rugby that the sides play in different leagues? So today we're going to look at some statistics and we're going to go through each of these opposition sides and see just where the differences lie. So the first question we're going to look at is the attacking game in the Gallagher Premiership better than in the Pro 14? Now, for anybody who's watched the Pro 14, they will definitely agree that the standard of rugby is far higher than it is in the Pro 14. The attacking levels, the intent the sides show from the outset, the line breaks and things like that the teams make, it just looks a far more attractive brand of rugby to watch. So, let's have a look at the stats to see whether that's true and whether we can back it up using this information. So here we have some attacking stats. We're going to start by looking at the amount of tries scored this season by the sides in the Gallagher Premiership and in the Pro 14. In the Gallagher Premiership, you'll see they've scored 469 tries this season in comparison to the Pro 14's 511. Now, the important thing to take into account with all of these stats is that the Gallagher Premiership sides have currently played one less game than the Pro 14 teams. But with that being said, looking at those statistics, if you average that out for each side, on average in the Premiership, teams are scoring roughly 39 tries so far this season. And in the Pro 14, the sides roughly averaged out at 42.5. Now, with that one game advantage, it would seem that more tries are being scored in the Guinness Pro 14. If we look at the average per game, though, it reads a different story altogether. Due to the one game less, the average in the Gallagher Premiership is 2.6 tries per game in relation to the 2.7 tries in the Guinness Pro 14. This does show that there are a lot more tries scored in the Pro 14, even if you take into account that the Premiership are only one game behind. With that, you wouldn't imagine that they're going to score 42 tries across the weekend. If they do, they'll see the two leagues really close together. So that doesn't really suggest that much. We do see this wide open expansive game in the Gallagher Premiership, but it doesn't always result in tries. So let's delve a little deeper and see if we can find something else to support the claims that the attack is better in the Premiership than it is in the Pro 14. So the one thing I think we can all agree on when we watch the Gallagher Premiership is the amount of line breaks and the attacking lines that teams run are superb to watch. But let's have a little look at the stats. In the Premiership, with that one game less, they have made 1,389 line breaks in comparison to the Pro 14's 1,209. If you look at that across the two sides and you average that out across their seasons, obviously in the Premiership so far, and the completed season for the Pro 14, sees 116 in the Premiership to 100 in the Pro 14, which sees roughly per game teams are averaging in the Premiership 8 line breaks a game in comparison to the Pro 14's 6. Now, this is the first sign that we've seen that the Premiership does have a slight more attacking edge in terms of their clean breaks. A lot of teams you see now in the Premiership look to try and penetrate that defence off first phase ball, and the most likely source of that is from line breaks. But once they break that line of defence and once they're on the attack, just how well are they finishing these opportunities off? Because we look back at the tries scored, and although they're outshining the Pro 14 in terms of line breaks, the Premiership is still not scoring as many tries as the Pro 14. So is there something else that can help us back this claim up that the attack is that much better? Let's have a little look. So we come on to defenders beaten. Now, this is, for me, one of the signs that they are a little closer together than we might imagine. If we look in the Premiership season so far, teams are averaging out 267 line breaks a game, okay? So if you add up all the line breaks that have been made in the Premiership this season, it comes out at 3,222. In the opposition then, in the Pro 14, we see 3,259, so slightly more in terms of the line breaks that the defenders they are beating, But if we look at the average, it's a lot higher, 272 roughly per season the teams are making. But the average per game, obviously, because the Premiership have played that one game less, they come a little closer together. You're averaging roughly 18 in the Premiership and 17 in the Pro 14. But for me, though, the big difference here is the standard of rugby across the Premiership in comparison to the Pro 14. If we look at where the teams finished up this year, a lot of teams shipping a lot of tries. And the biggest thing that I noticed when I was comparing these stats was that there were certain teams in the Premiership, that in the Pro 14, that were so much further ahead in terms of their line breaks, their tries scored. When you look at the opposite end of the table, the sides like Benetton, Zebra, Cardiff Blues, those sides are struggling a little bit more to get the tries in, to make the line breaks, and it's teams in the Pro 14 especially like Leinster, Munster, Ulster that are leading the way and pulling those sides along. Whereas if you look at the stats in the Gallagher Premiership, the sides are a lot closer together. The difference between top and bottom is a matter of tens, not hundreds. So looking at those stats alone, I can't think of any reason why we can say that the Gallagher Premiership is that much better than the Pro 14. We certainly see a standard difference, but what is it that makes the big difference? The next question that I've got is a really, really interesting one, and it'll certainly see where the differences are in terms of the styles of rugby that these teams play. So a question that gets asked an awful lot is there more of an emphasis on defence in the Guinness Pro 14 than there is in the Gallagher Premiership? We look at the terms of the intensity of the games that are played in the Gallagher Premiership, and especially the intensity these sides brought to the round of 16 knockout matches. If we look at the stats though, there is a massive, massive difference. So let's get into it and let's see how the Pro 14 stacks up against the Premiership. So if we're asking a question about defence, surely there's no better place to start than the amount of tackles that teams are making. If you look at the Pro 14, this is for me the biggest difficulty that we face in the Pro 14. We are making 28,442 tackles in a season in Pro 14 matches, which if you look at, now the season is finished, if you look at how many sides are making, it averages out at roughly 2,370 per season. Although the Premiership hasn't finished yet and they are one game behind in terms of games played, we look at the tackles made here. In the Premiership, they make 21,905 this season, which averages out at roughly 1,825. Looking at those stats alone, the Premiership are 500 tackles behind in terms of where the Pro 14 are. You look at that in terms of an average, on average per game, the Premiership are making 122 tackles, whereas the Pro 14 sides are having to make 148 tackles. That's over 25 more tackles. Now, looking at that in terms of the games across the weekend, if we look at the Dragons game, the Blues game, the defences simply ran out of ideas, and towards the end they simply couldn't live with the intensity of the Premiership sides. Maybe it's because they're not willing to accept the tackle. Maybe it's because they're far more sensible in terms of when they kick the ball, when they play the ball, sense when the opportunities are on, whereas the Pro 14 sides are maybe a little guilty of overplaying the ball and having to make those more tackles in terms of the opposition defence. But for me, it's all about context, okay? We're comparing the two leagues here. So I found a really interesting stat that compares the two leagues perfectly. So for me, when we're looking at this context, there was no other side that summed it up better than Benetton Rugby. A really difficult season where they made 1,934 tackles across the season. That placed them 12th in terms of the quality of their defence in the Pro 14. If you took that stat alone, the amount of tackles they make, they would actually become the 4th best defence in the Gallagher Premiership. That's a staggering stat. A side that haven't won a game all season in the Pro 14, in Benetton, have ranked as the 4th. If you took that stat simply and placed it into the Premiership table, they have made the 4th most amount of tackles out of any side in the Premiership. That's incredible. And considering what we were talking about just now in terms of sides matching the intensity for the full duration of the game, this is probably the biggest one. The worst defence in the Pro 14 is making the 4th most tackles in the Premiership. Just goes to show just how willing the Premiership are to keep the ball alive and to not accept the tackle or to look at creative ways to get around the tackle area. But it's not just tackles when we talk about defence. There's another area where the Pro 14 really concentrates on, in my opinion, in comparison to the Premiership opposition. Let's take a little look. So next, we're going to take a little look at turnovers. And for me, this is the one area that I feel that we put so much effort and emphasis into in the Pro 14. It really stacks up against these Premiership sides looking to attack. In the Pro 14 this season, there were a total of 1,050 turnovers, which per side averages out at around 87.5 turnovers. Compare this to the Gallagher Premiership. They've only made 896 turnovers, which averages out at around 75 per side this season. Now, looking at that alone, that's well over 100 more turnovers that are being made. For me, that's one thing that the Pro 14 prides itself on, is their ability to turn sides over, to put real pressure on the attacking teams and try and slow down that ball the best they can. In the Gallagher Premiership, there are still opportunities where the turnovers are effective, but for me, the Pro 14, that is their sole source of turnover ball. The way that they launch their attacks then is mainly through counter-attack, whereas like we mentioned earlier on, you look at the Gallagher Premiership in terms of their attack, and they start very much with first phase ball. As soon as they've got that first phase ball, they launch their attacks, and they keep that speeded ball going from there. Whereas the Pro 14 sides, and the next stat I'm going to show you now will back this up, the Pro 14 sides are almost looking to accept attacking sides, but look for opportunities to pinch that ball. Now, the next stat that we're going to look at just shows where roughly the Pro 14 sides are in comparison to the Gallagher Premiership. So, we're going to take a look at the Cardiff Blues. Cardiff Blues came out top this season in the amount of turnovers that they'd won. Players such as Ollie Robinson, Josh Turnbull, James Botham, all great turnover specialists. And they came out at the top of the Guinness Pro 14 this season with 104 turnovers won. If you stick that into the Gallagher Premiership stats, again, they come out top. So that shows you, and especially from a Blues fan's perspective, the Blues are willing to accept teams attacking them, but look for opportunities to turn that ball over. In comparison to the Gallagher Premiership sides, they want to try and keep that speed of ball as quickly as they can. You look very regularly in Pro 14, in Premiership games, the ruck speed is much under 2 seconds. Whereas in the Pro 14, we're more accepting of if sides are competing for the ball, we then go to kicking game and we look at other options to attack. So perhaps this is our biggest difference that we've seen so far. And I would agree with the statement that was made right at the start that yes, it does seem that the Pro 14 place a little more emphasis on their defence than they do in the Premiership. But we've got one more area that we're going to take a little look at, and we're going to see just how much of a difference internationals make to these sides. So, rather than comparing in this section, we're going to look at how internationals affect both sides. And the question we're going to look at is how much are teams from the Gallagher Premiership and the Pro 14 affected from international periods. Now, this has been brought to light recently by an article that I was reading a few days back from the Scarlets versus Sale game. It was said that during that game, there were instances where the Scarlets boys were actually caught out calling Welsh team calls, which it shows just how long these teams have been away from their club sides this season. It has been a crazy season. It's been a COVID year. We've had, in terms of internationals in this season, we've had to finish off the Guinness Six Nations. We've had the Autumn Nations Cup, and we've had the Six Nations already, and we're just going into April now. So let's have a look at just how badly these sides are affected by their international stars being away. So, we're going to start by looking at the Pro 14 sides that were knocked out of the tournament this weekend, okay? 4 Welsh regions, 1 Irish province, and 1 Italian side. Looking at them in terms of their international provenance, all 4 regions are in the sides that were knocked out, 4 Welsh regions. If we look in terms of the players that were lost to international duty, the Dragons lost 4 players, the Scarlets lost 11, Zebra, 12 players, the Cardiff Blues, 11 players, Connacht, 6, and the Ospreys, 5 players. Now, a friend of mine, Brandon Smith, over at Brandon Smith Rugby, we were talking about this in a show that we did on Monday night, and we were talking about when these international players come back into your side, there is almost that expectance that they're going to bring you back up to the level that you want to be competing at. If we look at Josh Adams for the Cardiff Blues this season, he's played 6 games, which in terms of you're looking at sides where their players don't go away on international duty. That is a far better return. 6 games. How much are the Blues getting out of Josh Adams playing just 6 games in a season? Again, this is not pointing the finger at any players, and it's not pointing the finger at any clubs. But when you look in a second and we look at the Gallagher Premiership sides and just how many players they're losing, you start to see the difference. But we can certainly see that the majority of the sides that were knocked out certainly have been impacted by their players leaving. For me, the Dragons are probably the exemption to this. They were quite fortunate this season in they were able to keep the majority of their squad together for the duration of the Six Nations through the Autumn Nations Cup, and they, for me, have started to build really, really nicely and start to play some nice rugby. Very, very unfortunate, in my opinion, to lose out, as in my opinion were the Cardiff Blues, but they are at the opposite end of the scale. 11 international players returning to the squad, and if we look at the game on Friday night against London Irish, all 11 of those players that were away at international camp featured somewhat in that game, whether they started or came off the bench. So is it an impact that they're having on the sides? We listened to that Scarlet's report that international players are calling international calls instead of Scarlet's calls. Just how much of an impact is it having on these regions and these clubs? But does it seem to have the same effect in the Premiership? Let's have a look at the sides that knocked these teams out and see how many players they lose to international breaks. So we've lined them up in terms of the games that were played, the players opposite the teams opposite the teams they played, and then how many players they lost. If we look from top to bottom of the Gallagher Premiership side, Northampton Saints lose 2 players during international periods, Sale Sharks 4, Bath 11, London Irish just 1, Leicester Tigers 5, and Newcastle Falcons just 2. The ones for me that stick out there are London Irish and Newcastle Falcons. In terms of the Cardiff Blues, 11 players coming back into that starting team. The one London Irish player that came back into the squad, Alan Dell, he didn't feature. So for us, we have to look at that and say, that London Irish side is far more settled than that Cardiff Blues side they came up against. They've managed to keep the majority of their squad during the entire season, and they've started to build some really nice patterns and really nice phases of play together. The Blues, however, were introducing new players back into the teams. The half-pack pairing of Jared Evans and Thomas Williams. Jared Evans having just played 1 game since being away at the international camp and came back in a big European game. It's really difficult for these players to get back up to speed, and especially at that top level. Now, in a season where it's a non-COVID year and things are a little bit more spaced out, you might not see these results in such a graphic way. But for me, looking at 6 teams getting knocked out by Gallagher Premiership opposition, you have to start asking the questions as to why. We look at Bath, 11 players lost to international breaks. And for me, Bath are the one Premiership side this season that have stuttered and stumbled their way through the year. At times, they play some really, really nice rugby with the likes of Talupe Faletau, Anthony Watson, Ben Spencer at 9. They play a really nice brand of rugby. But then, Watson, Talupe Faletau, they go away for international break. And sometimes that's when you see the biggest difference in their play. Looking at Newcastle Falcons, myself and Brandon again talked about this a few weeks back, and we looked at the fact that Newcastle Falcons are not a team that are packed full of international superstars. Like we just mentioned with Bath there, Talupe Faletau, Anthony Watson, Rocca Daguni, Cameron Redpath as well, the new Scottish guy. All these players have stardust. You look at the Newcastle team, not to say that they're not good players, but they don't rely on that stardust ability. They just got a group of players that work really, really well together. And for me, against the Ospreys, they looked like they wanted it far, far more. But for me, the Premiership sides, on paper, in terms of stats, they are affected less by the international periods. So that's my comparison and that's my summary of the Gallagher Premiership versus the Pro 14 sides. Like I said, all these have just been based on my own opinions and the stats that I could find on all the sides that were involved. Love to see your thoughts and your opinions down in the comments. I will try and address every comment that goes down there. Thank you very much for joining me for my very first video on Rock and Roll Rugby. Be sure to like and subscribe, okay? And we will see you ready for the next one.